The story of ancient Egypt is often bathed in golden light, towering pyramids, majestic gods, and a civilization that spanned millennia. But lurking beneath this grandeur were the ruthless struggles for power that defined the reigns of its queens. In a land where the pharaohs were seen as divine beings, their queens often wielded power in the shadows, pushing the boundaries of what it meant to rule. This section begins by setting the stage for the unsettling truths that lie ahead, drawing the audience into the world of these women who, despite their exalted status, were not immune to the cutthroat politics of their time. Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti, names synonymous with power, beauty, and mystery. While history celebrates their triumphs, it rarely touches on the darker methods they employed to secure and maintain their reigns. The seductive allure of Cleopatra, the defiant rise of Hatshepsut, and the silent manipulation of Nefertiti each reveal a psychological complexity far beyond the royal images they project. These women were not just figurehead rulers, they were ruthless strategists, driven by the primal need to survive in a world where power was fleeting and rivals lurked at every corner. The primary aim here is to set the tone of the documentary, hinting at the forbidden aspects of their reigns. The audience is led to understand that these queens were not simply empowered by their bloodlines or their beauty, but by their cunning, manipulation, and in some cases, their brutal actions. They were queens who understood the price of power, and the sacrifices they had to make to keep it. Through this introduction, the narrative will delve into the psychological forces at play, showing how these queens' need to preserve their thrones drove them to commit acts that would haunt not only their legacies but also the very fabric of Egyptian history. The story of Egypt's queens is one of stark contrasts: reverence versus ruthlessness, divine status versus human frailty, and beauty masked over brutal realities. The audience will soon realize that maintaining power in a world ruled by men was far more than a battle for survival. It was an intricate dance of blood, betrayal, and forbidden alliances. The queens of Egypt played this game with exceptional skill, but at a great cost. And their legacies, while still remembered for their glory, are forever shadowed by the methods they employed to get there. In ancient Egypt, women were revered not only as the mothers of dynasties but also as powerful figures capable of influencing the course of history. The land of the pharaohs is often associated with grand monuments and divine kings, but beneath the surface, there was a complex power structure that allowed queens and royal women to wield significant political influence. Yet this power, while real, was fraught with limitations and constantly under threat. To understand the lengths these women went to in order to secure and maintain power, we must first explore the role that women played within the fabric of Egyptian society and how the divine and political intersected in a world that was both progressive and oppressive. In Egyptian culture, women were seen as both sacred and essential to the continuity of life. The goddess Hathor, who represented love, beauty, and fertility, was one of the most revered deities in the pantheon, symbolizing the power of women. Yet, as revered as they were in the spiritual and familial realms, women in Egypt did not always possess the freedom to fully act upon that power in the public and political spheres. Egyptian society, like many ancient civilizations, was patriarchal. Kings, or pharaohs, were the primary rulers, and their divine right to govern was rooted in the belief that they were chosen by the gods. However, the political system of Egypt was far more fluid than most people realize. When a pharaoh died without a male heir, the throne could fall to a daughter or a wife, and women could and did assume power. The key to this power was often their ability to harness the divine authority that Egypt's religious system provided. Women could claim to be goddesses or, at the very least, divinely chosen through their marriage to a pharaoh or their relationship with the gods. The royal bloodline was considered sacred, and queens, as the bearers of this blood, could hold incredible influence, especially in times of dynastic crisis. One of the most significant roles women played in maintaining power was in their ability to marry strategically. Marriages to pharaohs were not simply about love or personal connection but were political alliances meant to consolidate power. Queens could maintain their influence through these marriages, using their relationship with the ruling pharaoh as a means to secure their position. In the absence of a king, a queen could rule in her own right or act as a regent for her son, and in this capacity she wielded power with the full weight of royal legitimacy behind her. Yet, despite the power that these women held, they had to constantly navigate the fine line between maintaining their divine status and dealing with the political dangers of being a female ruler in a male-dominated world. The queens of Egypt knew that their power was often temporary and precarious, and they had to maneuver with caution to prevent their rivals from seizing control. To achieve this, they resorted to a variety of tactics, some morally questionable and others downright ruthless. They could use religion and mythology to bolster their rule, depicting themselves as living goddesses or as direct representatives of the gods on earth. One fascinating aspect of women's political power in Egypt was their involvement in the religious sphere. Pharaohs, as the living gods of Egypt, were often linked to specific deities, and their queens were likewise associated with powerful goddesses. The high priestesses of Hathor, Isis, and other female deities held significant sway, and the queen's ability to align themselves with these religious forces added a divine layer to their political power. When a queen assumed the title of pharaoh, as in the case of Hatshepsut, she was not only a ruler, she was the embodiment of a god on earth. The act of adopting male attire and titles was not just an assertion of power, it was a religious declaration that she was the physical manifestation of divine will. For these queens, the divine right to rule wasn't just a ceremonial claim, it was a vital tool that helped them to manipulate both the gods and their subjects. They could claim divine favor to justify actions that might otherwise be seen as unacceptable, like the murder of rivals or the usurpation of the throne. This divine association also created a mystique around their reigns, allowing them to retain authority even in the face of growing opposition. The queen's ability to maintain political power was also tied to their strategic use of their sexuality. In a world where marriage was often the key to political alliances, their relationships with powerful men, be they pharaohs, generals, or foreign dignitaries, were essential to securing their position. Cleopatra's infamous relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not just matters of passion, they were calculated moves in a dangerous game of political survival. Through these alliances, Cleopatra secured her throne and ensured Egypt's place in the Roman political sphere. These relationships, while often portrayed as romantic, were in fact complex, political maneuvers that were integral to her strategy for maintaining power. However, even the most powerful women were not safe from the shifting tides of Egyptian politics. When a male heir was available, women could quickly lose their power and be replaced by a son or a more politically favorable ruler. Despite their divine associations and political influence, the queens of Egypt lived in constant fear of betrayal, assassination, or exile. Their reigns, though marked by moments of greatness, were always at risk of crumbling under the weight of political ambition and court intrigue. Ultimately, the queens of Egypt were both powerful and vulnerable. They wielded influence through divine connections, political alliances, and strategic marriages, but their power was always precarious. Their ability to navigate this complex landscape of politics, religion, and gender was what allowed them to maintain their rule for as long as they did. The fascinating thing about these women is that their power was not granted by birthright alone. It was earned through manipulation, cunning, and a deep understanding of the political and spiritual forces at play. They were queens in a land of gods, but their rule was forged in the very human struggle for survival. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, is a name that resonates with power, seduction, and intrigue. History often depicts her as a glamorous, enigmatic woman who captivated two of the most powerful men of the ancient world, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Yet, the story of Cleopatra is not merely one of romance and beauty, it is a chilling tale of political cunning, calculated manipulation, and survival in the brutal world of Roman imperialism. Her reign, marked by tumultuous alliances and deadly betrayals, reveals a mind that operated not only as a queen, but as a master strategist, an intellect whose actions would determine the future of Egypt itself. The image of Cleopatra that has persisted for centuries is one of an alluring seductress, a woman whose charm and beauty were so captivating that they bent even the mightiest men to her will. But this portrayal obscures the darker truths about how Cleopatra used her relationships with these men as tools to secure and maintain her reign. The power struggles of Cleopatra's time were not just fought on battlefields, they were fought in the hearts and minds of the most influential leaders of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra's love affairs were not purely personal. Each was an intricate, politically motivated maneuver aimed at protecting her throne and Egypt's independence from the expanding power of Rome. Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar was not just a love affair, it was an alliance forged out of necessity. At the time of their meeting, Egypt was embroiled in a civil war, and Cleopatra's position on the throne was precarious. Her brother Ptolemy XIII, who was also her co-ruler, had driven her into exile, and her return to power required not only military strength but also the support of a powerful foreign ally. Caesar, then the most powerful man in Rome, had his own ambitions, and his alliance with Cleopatra was beneficial to both. Through her seduction of Caesar, Cleopatra not only regained her throne but also solidified her place as a key player in the political chessboard of the ancient world. The legendary meeting between Cleopatra and Caesar, where she famously had herself smuggled into the palace rolled up in a carpet, is emblematic of her willingness to use any means necessary to achieve her political goals. It is said that she and Caesar were instantly drawn to each other, a connection that quickly turned into both an affair and a political alliance. Cleopatra's intimate relationship with Caesar was deeply strategic. By aligning herself with him, she ensured Egypt's position within the Roman sphere of influence, gaining his military support to reclaim her throne. In return, Caesar gained a loyal ally in Egypt, a region rich in resources and strategic importance. But Cleopatra's machinations did not end with Caesar. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra found herself once again vulnerable. Her political future was uncertain, and her survival depended on securing a new powerful ally. It was then that Mark Antony entered the picture. Antony, like Caesar before him, was a military leader with significant political influence, but he was also a man torn between his ambitions in Rome and his desires. Cleopatra's relationship with Antony, much like her affair with Caesar, was not driven by passion alone but by political calculation. She knew that aligning herself with Antony, a member of Rome's ruling triumvirate, would secure her position in Egypt and strengthen her hold on the throne. The courtship between Cleopatra and Antony was fraught with political intrigue and mutual manipulation. Cleopatra was shrewd enough to realize that Antony was seeking not just an ally but a queen who could help him solidify his power. In return for her support, Antony granted Cleopatra control over vast territories, including parts of Syria and Palestine. This arrangement was not merely a love affair, it was a political and military partnership that would help them both in their quest for dominance. Their relationship, steeped in both affection and ambition, was a dangerous game of power that would ultimately lead to one of the most famous military confrontations in history, the Battle of Actium. However, as Cleopatra's alliances became increasingly intertwined with Rome's politics, her own fate grew ever more uncertain. The power struggle between Antony and Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of ideologies. Octavian, who would eventually rise to power as the first Roman emperor, saw Antony's relationship with Cleopatra as a threat to Rome's power and stability. To Octavian, Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was a symbol of Rome's vulnerability and the potential loss of control over its vast empire. The public's perception of Cleopatra as a manipulative foreign queen, one who had seduced two of Rome's greatest leaders, became a rallying cry for Octavian as he waged a propaganda war against her. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was the culmination of this struggle. In one of the most dramatic naval battles in history, Cleopatra and Antony's forces were decisively defeated by Octavian's fleet. The aftermath of the battle was devastating for Cleopatra. Her lover, Antony, committed suicide after believing that Cleopatra had died, and she soon followed suit, taking her own life in 30 BCE. Their deaths marked the end of Egypt's independence and the beginning of Egypt's annexation into the Roman Empire. Cleopatra's death was not just the end of a life but the tragic conclusion to a reign that had been marked by calculated love, strategic alliances, and ruthless political maneuvering. Her legacy is a complex one, full of contradictions. To some, she is a tragic heroine who fought to the very end for her kingdom. To others, she is a manipulative seductress whose actions led to the downfall of her dynasty and the end of Egypt's great civilization. But in truth, Cleopatra was both of these things. A master of political strategy who used her charm and intellect to navigate the brutal realities of her time. Her reign serves as a chilling reminder of the price of power. Cleopatra's love affairs, far from being the romantic tales they are often portrayed as, were the means by which she secured her throne, protected her people and maintained Egypt's influence in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. She understood that in the harsh, unforgiving world of ancient politics, love and sex were not mere indulgences but essential tools of survival. In the end, Cleopatra's story is one of betrayal, not just by others but by the very political system that she had tried to manipulate and control. It is a story of a queen who sought to maintain her power, only to see it slip away in the face of forces much larger than herself. The story of Hatshepsut, the longest reigning female pharaoh of ancient Egypt, is one of political audacity, bold strategy and unrelenting ambition. Hatshepsut's rise to power was nothing short of extraordinary. Unusual not only because of her gender but because she was determined to reshape the very nature of Egyptian rule. Her reign, which lasted for over 2 decades, was characterized by an unusual blend of regal sophistication and ruthless calculation. The more you delve into her life and rule, the clearer it becomes that Hatshepsut was not just a passive figurehead or a token queen, but a shrewd, calculating ruler whose reign would alter Egypt's political landscape forever. Hatshepsut's rise to the throne was steeped in tragedy and intrigue. Born as the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, she initially had little expectation of ever assuming the throne. The traditional practice in Egypt dictated that the crown would pass through the male lineage, and Hatshepsut's brother, Thutmose II, was expected to be the next ruler. However, when her husband brother Thutmose II died prematurely, the young Hatshepsut found herself in a precarious position. Instead of simply playing the role of a queen consort, she initially assumed the role of regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, the son of Thutmose II and a lesser wife. But Hatshepsut was not content to merely hold power behind the scenes. She was determined to rule in her own right. At the time, Egypt was not ready for a female pharaoh. However, Hatshepsut had a cunning plan. She began by asserting herself politically and gradually began to adopt the symbols of male pharaohs. In an unprecedented move, Hatshepsut not only adopted the title of pharaoh but also took on the full regalia of male kingship, donning the traditional false beard and male clothing. This was a bold move, a politically charged assertion of power that was meant to convey that she was not just a queen but a ruler in the truest sense of the word. To the public and the court, she was not just a woman, she was now a king, embodying the divine authority of the pharaohs. Her decision to take on male attire and titles was not just symbolic, it was a strategic maneuver to solidify her claim to the throne and to show that she could rule Egypt with the same authority as any man. By adopting these visual markers of kingship, Hatshepsut sought to erase any doubt about her legitimacy and her ability to govern. It also allowed her to distance herself from the constraints of femininity in a society that viewed men as the natural rulers. Through this act, Hatshepsut sent a clear message to her court and the people of Egypt. She was not simply a temporary figurehead, she was the ruler of Egypt, capable of making decisions that affected the entire kingdom. But Hatshepsut's reign was not just about the symbolic gestures of power, it was about securing her dynasty and her legacy. As a woman in a patriarchal society, she had to be far more strategic and calculating than her male counterparts, constantly navigating the treacherous waters of court politics, succession disputes, and external threats. One of her most cunning moves was her construction of monumental building projects, the most famous being her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. This temple, with its towering columns and awe-inspiring reliefs, not only honored the gods in her reign but also established Hatshepsut as a legitimate ruler in the eyes of her people. The temple was an assertion of her divine right to rule, a statement of permanence in a world that often viewed women's power as fleeting. Hatshepsut's building projects, including a trade expedition to the land of Punt, modern-day Somalia or Ethiopia, also served as a demonstration of her political acumen. The expedition, which brought back vast wealth, exotic goods and rare trees, cemented her status as a powerful and capable ruler. It was a testament to her ability to engage in diplomacy, expand Egypt's economic influence, and secure her people's prosperity. In her reign, Egypt's wealth and prestige were at their peak, and Hatshepsut was at the heart of this success. She used every tool at her disposal, religion, diplomacy, military strategy, and architectural prowess, to create a lasting legacy. However, her rise to power and her increasingly autocratic rule were not without controversy. The most significant threat to her reign came not from external enemies but from within her own court. Thutmose III, her stepson, had been sidelined during her rule, and as he grew older he became increasingly resentful of his mother's authority. Though Hatshepsut presented Thutmose III as her co-regent, it was clear that the real power lay with her. As a result, after her death, Thutmose III sought to erase his stepmother's legacy. In a bid to assert his own authority and reclaim the pharaonic throne for the male line, Thutmose III ordered the deliberate destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments, including defacing her statues and erasing her name from temple inscriptions. This act of erasure, however, only highlights the fragile nature of Hatshepsut's position. Despite the grandeur of her reign, she was ultimately unable to secure her legacy in the way that male pharaohs could. Her tomb was left unfinished, her monuments were vandalized, and her memory was systematically obliterated. But over time, Hatshepsut's story has been rediscovered, and modern scholars have come to view her not just as a usurper or a figure of controversy, but as one of the most remarkable rulers in Egyptian history. Her reign, once overshadowed by the efforts to erase her, is now seen as a powerful example of what women could achieve when given the opportunity to rule. Hatshepsut's story is a haunting reminder of the fine line between power and erasure. Her determination to carve out a place for herself in the male-dominated world of Egyptian rulership was extraordinary, but it came with a heavy cost. Her legacy, though nearly destroyed, has endured, and in many ways she stands as a symbol of the lengths to which women had to go in order to gain and maintain power in a world that was not made for them. Hatshepsut's reign, marked by deception, manipulation, and bold actions, serves as a testament to the complex interplay of gender, politics, and survival in the ancient world. Nefertiti, one of the most famous and enigmatic queens in Egyptian history, is often remembered for her beauty, symbolized by the iconic bust that still graces museums today. But Nefertiti's legacy extends far beyond her appearance. She was a ruler in her own right, and her reign is shrouded in mystery and intrigue. The depths of her influence and the brutal politics that defined her reign have been obscured by time, but what we do know paints a picture of a woman who wielded power in ways that were both subtle and devastating. To understand Nefertiti's true legacy, one must look beyond her stunning visage and into the dark shadows of her rule, where the lines between love, ambition, and power blurred into dangerous territory. Nefertiti's rise to power was rooted in her marriage to Pharaoh Akhenaten, a ruler who is most famous for abandoning the traditional polytheistic worship of Egypt's gods in favor of a radical monotheism centered around the sun god Aten. Akhenaten's religious revolution was one of the most profound shifts in ancient Egyptian society, and Nefertiti stood alongside him as a powerful co-regent. While Akhenaten's radicalism redefined Egypt's spiritual landscape, Nefertiti's role in this transformation remains largely debated. Some scholars suggest that she was not just a passive figure beside her husband but an active participant in his religious reforms. In fact, there are indications that Nefertiti may have been seen as the physical embodiment of the Aten, serving as both queen and high priestess of this new solar religion. The political implications of this shift were immense. Akhenaten's rejection of Egypt's traditional gods alienated many of the kingdom's priesthoods and elites, throwing Egypt into a period of instability. Nefertiti, as the queen of this new religious order, stood at the epicenter of these changes, but her power went far beyond her religious role. Her position as Akhenaten's chief wife, while also a ruling figure in her own right, allowed her to exert influence in the royal court and beyond. As Akhenaten's partner, she was often depicted in the royal art as having an almost equal standing with her husband, participating in ceremonies and rituals, a rare honor for a woman in ancient Egypt. Yet, Nefertiti's true power lay not just in her religious role or her beauty, but in her political maneuvering. While Akhenaten's reign was marked by radical changes, it was also defined by political upheaval. The abandonment of Thebes, the former capital, in favor of the newly established city of Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, alienated many powerful factions. This political volatility left room for court intrigue, and Nefertiti, ever the strategist, seized the opportunity to cement her own power. The true nature of her influence at this time is difficult to ascertain, but there are suggestions that she may have ruled alone for a time after Akhenaten's death. Some Egyptologists believe that Nefertiti may have briefly assumed the title of pharaoh, ruling under the name Smenkhare, though this theory remains speculative. However, it is clear that her influence in the royal court did not end with her husband's death. As her reign progressed, Nefertiti's political prowess grew even more apparent. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt plunged into a period of instability, with the throne passing rapidly between different rulers. During this time, Nefertiti's name disappeared from the official records, which suggests that she may have been overthrown or, more likely, forced into the background as the political situation shifted. This erasure from history, whether through her own choice or as a result of court politics, is a critical point in understanding Nefertiti's power and the dangers women faced in the royal courts of Egypt. Despite her apparent withdrawal from the official record, Nefertiti's legacy is far from being a quiet one. In fact, her image as a powerful queen has only grown over time, especially as modern archaeologists and historians continue to uncover more about her life and reign. Some of the most recent findings suggest that Nefertiti may have played a far more significant role than previously thought. Her depiction in art often shows her in a dominant position, equal to or even more powerful than her husband in some scenes. These depictions challenge the conventional view of Nefertiti as simply a beautiful consort to a great pharaoh. Instead, they suggest that she was an active participant in the political and religious transformations that defined her era. One of the most intriguing aspects of Nefertiti's reign is the mystery surrounding her death and her final years. After her apparent disappearance from the historical record, Egypt was left in turmoil. The brief reign of her daughter Ankhesenamun was marked by a return to the traditional polytheistic practices that Akhenaten had rejected, and the power of the Aten was diminished. The legacy of Nefertiti's radical shift in Egyptian religion was rapidly dismantled, but her influence lingered in the collective memory of the Egyptian people. What remains most unsettling about Nefertiti's story is the ambiguity surrounding her legacy. Was she a puppet queen, manipulated by the whims of her husband and political forces beyond her control? Or was she a calculating and ruthless ruler who used her beauty, her intelligence, and her influence to carve out a place of power in a male-dominated world? It is likely that Nefertiti was a combination of both, a woman who wielded both charm and political savvy to secure her place in history, but who was also subject to the harsh realities of life in the royal court, where survival often depended on the ability to navigate treacherous waters. Her role as a mother to Tutankhamun adds another layer of complexity to her story. Some scholars argue that Nefertiti's influence over her son's reign was substantial, and that her legacy continued to shape the course of Egypt even after her disappearance from the throne. Whether or not she was directly involved in the rule of Tutankhamun remains unclear, but there are compelling arguments that suggest she was more than just a distant figure in the background of her son's reign. This connection to the boy king reinforces the idea that Nefertiti's power, though hidden at times, was always present, shaping the fate of Egypt for generations to come. Ultimately, Nefertiti's legacy is one that challenges conventional perceptions of power. She was not simply the beautiful queen in the shadow of her husband, she was a powerful and intelligent ruler in her own right. Her reign was one of beauty, ambition, and manipulation, a queen who used every tool at her disposal to maintain her influence and to craft her own legacy. Her story is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder of the complexities of power, the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated world, and the ways in which history can obscure the true nature of a ruler's reign. Nefertiti's shadow still looms over Egypt, and in the quiet corners of history her legacy continues to unravel. In the ancient world, where power was the ultimate currency, sex was not merely a private or personal matter, it was a tool, a weapon, a strategic asset. Nowhere is this more evident than in the sexual politics of the queens of Egypt. These women, often painted in the annals of history as figures of grace and beauty, wielded their sexuality not just as a source of personal pleasure but as a calculated means to secure and maintain political power. In a male-dominated society, where the throne was primarily inherited through bloodlines, these queens understood that their control over their own bodies could influence the fate of kingdoms. Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and Hatshepsut. Each of these women mastered the art of sexual politics in ways that reshaped the course of history. Sex was the unspoken currency of the royal courts. The queens of Egypt were expected to secure their positions by producing heirs, which often meant marrying men who could strengthen their bloodlines. But it wasn't just about love or motherhood, it was about power dynamics, alliances, and survival. The political system was a high-stakes game, where intimate relationships with powerful men were essential for a queen's reign. Sexuality, in this context, became a tool of survival and dominance, a means by which these women could manipulate their circumstances and the men around them. One of the most infamous figures in this realm is Cleopatra VII, whose relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony have become the stuff of legend. However, these relationships were far from mere romantic entanglements, they were carefully orchestrated political alliances. Cleopatra was not just seduced by Caesar and Antony, she used them. Her sexual liaisons were part of a broader strategy to maintain her throne in a volatile world where Egypt's independence was under constant threat from the growing Roman Empire. By aligning herself with Caesar, Cleopatra solidified her power as Queen of Egypt after the death of her father and the political turmoil that followed. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra found herself in need of a new protector, Mark Antony. Her relationship with Antony was both a personal and political maneuver. By becoming his lover, Cleopatra ensured that she would continue to have a voice in Roman politics, as Antony was a key member of the Roman triumvirate. Their alliance, though filled with passion, was not devoid of calculation. Cleopatra needed Antony as much as he needed her. Through their affair, she gained military support, trade benefits, and perhaps most importantly, a shield from Octavian, Antony's rival and the future Emperor Augustus. The sexuality that Cleopatra wielded was not just about seduction but about shaping the political landscape of the Mediterranean. She understood that her body could serve as a weapon of statecraft, and she used it with remarkable precision. But Cleopatra was not the only queen who understood the power of sexual politics. Nefertiti, though often remembered for her beauty, was also a savvy political player who knew that her sexuality could be a means of furthering her rule. Married to Pharaoh Akhenaten, she shared in his religious reforms, but it is believed that Nefertiti may have been more than just a figurehead. As the co-regent of Akhenaten, Nefertiti helped to implement the radical shift to Atenism, a monotheistic religion that centered around the sun god Aten. In a society that relied on divine authority to legitimize rulers, Nefertiti's role as the queen consort of the pharaoh elevated her status. However, it was likely that her influence in the political sphere was not solely due to her position as Akhenaten's wife but also because of her ability to navigate the complex web of royal power dynamics, including her sexual and personal influence. Nefertiti's role was not just ceremonial. Many historians believe she may have ruled in her own right after Akhenaten's death, possibly even adopting the title of pharaoh under the name of Smenkhare. This transition, however, was not without opposition. Akhenaten's reforms had alienated many powerful factions, and Nefertiti's position in the aftermath was precarious. While it is not certain whether she ruled as pharaoh, her political survival would have depended on her ability to form alliances, and it is highly likely that her sexuality played a role in securing those alliances, whether through her personal relationships or through the use of her daughters as political pawns in royal marriages. Hatshepsut, though less known for her relationships with men, also understood the power of sexual politics. As the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and the wife of her half-brother, Thutmose II, Hatshepsut initially played the role of queen consort. However, after her husband's death, Hatshepsut seized control of the throne as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. While many see Hatshepsut's rise to power as a political maneuver, it is important to consider the role her sexuality might have played. Unlike her contemporaries, Hatshepsut adopted male titles and regalia, asserting that she was not merely a queen but a pharaoh. Her ability to ascend to the throne was in part due to her strategic manipulation of the power dynamics in the royal court, including her marriage and the manipulation of familial relationships. In all of these cases, sexuality became an integral part of the political equation. For queens like Cleopatra and Nefertiti, their bodies were the site of not only physical relationships but also power plays. The romantic alliances they forged were not simply about love or affection. They were calculated moves to ensure that their kingdoms and their thrones remained secure. These women knew that in a patriarchal society, their sexual relationships with powerful men could determine their survival. And when those relationships turned sour or when their political needs shifted, they were not afraid to manipulate or discard their former lovers, making sexual politics a double-edged sword. In ancient Egypt, the body was both a source of beauty and a tool of power. Women were celebrated for their fertility, their capacity to bear heirs, and their sensuality. But behind the allure and the charm was a strategic mind, always calculating, always assessing the best way to wield sexual power to its fullest potential. The queens of Egypt were not just pawns in a patriarchal game, they were players in their own right, using every advantage at their disposal to retain their grip on power. Sexual politics, then, was not a passive affair but a dynamic, ever-shifting arena where queens navigated not only their own desires but the desires of the most powerful men in the world. The concept of sex as power is not a modern invention, it is an ancient reality. The queens of Egypt understood this better than anyone, using their beauty, their charm, and their sexual relationships to cement their political positions, forge alliances, and manipulate the course of history. The allure of their bodies may have sparked the desires of kings and emperors, but it was their intellect, cunning, and ruthless determination that allowed them to rule in a world that was far more dangerous than their beauty ever suggested. And in the shadows of their reigns, sexual politics was the silent force that helped them carve their names into history. In the dangerous world of ancient Egypt, where power was often a matter of life and death, the throne could be a blood-stained seat, won and kept only by the most ruthless methods. The queens of Egypt, though often portrayed as graceful figures of beauty and divine authority, were also deeply entrenched in the treacherous political maneuvering that surrounded the royal court. Power struggles, assassination plots, and deadly betrayal were constant realities in the quest for the throne. The survival of a queen was not just a matter of royal bloodline, but the ability to eliminate rivals, control alliances, and use every tool at her disposal to secure her reign. This section reveals the bloody, brutal side of ancient Egyptian royalty. The assassinations, the betrayals, and the deadly schemes that ensured power was not simply inherited, but fought for in the shadows. The history of Egypt's royal court is marked by intrigue, conspiracy, and violence. Dynastic succession was never as simple as passing the crown from father to son. Court politics were vicious and often involved ruthless measures, including the assassination of rivals, the manipulation of family members, and the systematic eradication of those seen as threats to the throne. For women in power, the price of maintaining the throne could be particularly steep. A queen, whether ruling as a co-regent or as a sole monarch, often had to resort to violent tactics to protect her position and eliminate any challenge to her authority. Cleopatra's reign offers a chilling example of this brutal world. Cleopatra's power was built not just on her relationships with powerful men, but on her ability to outwit, outmaneuver, and eliminate anyone who posed a threat to her rule. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, Cleopatra found herself facing a new threat in the form of the Roman Senate and its ambitions to expand Roman power throughout the Mediterranean. It was then that she turned to Mark Antony, securing her position as the Queen of Egypt through a political and sexual alliance. However, despite her skill at forging alliances, Cleopatra was far from naive about the dangers of power. When Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, rose to challenge Antony for control of Rome, Cleopatra knew that her life, and Egypt's sovereignty, depended on eliminating this threat. The backdrop to Cleopatra's story is a world where assassination was seen as a necessary evil for political survival. Caesar's murder, orchestrated by members of his own inner circle, had created a political vacuum that Cleopatra could exploit. But Octavian was no fool. He understood that the Egyptian queen was not just a seductress but a formidable political player, and he saw her as a rival who threatened Rome's ambitions in the East. In this context, Cleopatra's power was not just derived from her ability to form alliances, but from her ruthlessness in dealing with enemies, both external and internal. The strategic moves she made in forming alliances and eliminating rivals were as much about survival as they were about maintaining power. But the use of assassination as a political tool was not confined to Cleopatra. In the case of Hatshepsut, her rise to power came through a combination of cunning and the elimination of rivals. Though she began her reign as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, it wasn't long before Hatshepsut took the bold step of claiming the throne as her own, adopting male attire and taking the title of pharaoh. This move likely alienated many within the royal court, especially those who believed that Thutmose III as the male heir should rightfully rule. However, Hatshepsut was not content with merely claiming the throne. She needed to eliminate any threats to her rule. Historians believe that after Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III sought to erase his stepmother's legacy. One of the most startling acts of political violence was Thutmose III's systematic destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments and statues. This was not merely a matter of symbolic removal, it was an attempt to erase her from history itself. Thutmose III's actions indicate the depth of the animosity between the two, suggesting that Hatshepsut's reign, while marked by stability and prosperity, was also fraught with internal conflict. In this context, the destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments can be seen as a form of political assassination, an attempt to eliminate her memory and claim the throne for himself. The act of erasure was both a personal and political statement, showing just how far Thutmose III was willing to go to secure his reign and assert his dominance over his stepmother's legacy. Similarly, Nefertiti's reign was also filled with intrigue, manipulation, and potential assassination. After the death of her husband, Akhenaten, Nefertiti's name vanished from the official records, sparking speculation about what happened to her. Some scholars believe she may have ruled Egypt under the name Smenkhare for a brief time, but this theory remains speculative. The lack of evidence surrounding her disappearance, along with the subsequent rise of Tutankhamun, suggests that Nefertiti's fall from power may have been tied to a covert struggle for control of Egypt. It is believed that following Akhenaten's death, a power struggle broke out between various factions within the court. Some evidence suggests that Nefertiti may have been forced into the background or even eliminated in the aftermath of Akhenaten's religious reforms. The royal court, deeply divided over the future of Atenism, was rife with political infighting, and Nefertiti's disappearance could have been the result of such courtly machinations. Whether she was overthrown or died under mysterious circumstances, the power struggles that defined her later years were a grim reminder of the danger faced by women in the ancient royal courts. The notion of assassination and betrayal in royal courts isn't confined to Egypt. It echoes throughout history, from the brutal murders of emperors and kings to the elimination of rivals in every power structure. But in Egypt, where dynastic rule was so sacred, the violence behind the throne was often obscured by divine legitimacy. The queens of Egypt, while revered as divine figures, were deeply aware that their power could be taken away at any moment, and thus, they employed extreme measures to keep their position secure. The stories of these queens are not just tales of grandeur or love, but also of the cost of power. Their reigns, marked by bloodshed, betrayal, and calculated deception, are testaments to the lengths one must go to in order to maintain a throne in a world where nothing is permanent, and every ally could be a potential enemy. The queens of Egypt wielded their power with an understanding that the throne they occupied was often soaked in the blood of those who sought to take it from them. In the end, their stories are not just of regal opulence but of survival, sacrifice, and the dark truths that lay behind the power they held. Power has a price, and for the queens of ancient Egypt, that cost was often measured in blood, betrayal, and moral compromise. The ruthless strategies they employed to secure their thrones and retain power were not merely a matter of political survival. They represented a fundamental clash between personal ambition, the desire for survival, and the ethical consequences of their actions. These queens, while revered for their beauty and strength, were not immune to the darker aspects of governance. They were deeply aware that their authority could be taken at any moment, and their rule was often built on a foundation of manipulation, sacrifice, and ethical ambiguity. The question that hangs over the legacies of these women is not just about the methods they used to secure power, but whether their actions, at times marked by cruelty and deception, can be justified by the end they sought, to preserve their dynasties, their lands, and their very lives. The morality of their decisions is what makes their stories both tragic and fascinating. Were these queens victims of a brutal system that forced them to make impossible choices, or were they willing participants in a political game where no morality could survive if it stood in the way of securing their throne? Take Cleopatra, for instance, whose reign was built on a series of alliances formed not by affection, but by necessity. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not about love but about securing Egypt's place in the Roman world. In this context, Cleopatra's romantic entanglements appear far less like acts of passion and far more like political tools she wielded with remarkable skill. But the price of these relationships was not just the manipulation of powerful men, it was the destruction of any notion of romantic purity or personal morality. By aligning herself with men who were, in some ways, ruthless and power-hungry, Cleopatra sacrificed any pretense of innocence. Yet, she did so with the belief that her country's survival depended on it. Her actions were not those of a woman seeking personal happiness, but of a ruler driven by the harsh realities of a world where only the most powerful survived. In many ways, Cleopatra's moral compromise was a response to the existential threats she faced. She understood that in a world where Egypt's sovereignty was constantly at risk from Rome's imperial expansion, she could not afford to be passive. For Cleopatra, the end justified the means, and that meant using her sexuality, her intelligence, and her political cunning to outmaneuver her enemies. But the question remains, did the ends justify the means? Was the cost of her alliances too great, and did she lose something essential in the process? Hatshepsut's story presents a different moral dilemma, one rooted in identity and self-representation. As a woman who ascended to the throne, she had to navigate the patriarchal structures of ancient Egypt, a society that did not easily accept female rulers. In order to legitimize her rule, Hatshepsut not only assumed the role of pharaoh but also adopted male attire, a false beard, and male pronouns. In doing so, she erased her femininity in favor of an identity that was politically expedient. But what does this transformation say about her morality? Was it an act of pragmatic self-preservation, or did it reveal a deeper internalized sexism that made her feel the need to suppress her gender in order to gain power? In her quest for legitimacy, Hatshepsut also made difficult decisions regarding her own family. By eliminating political rivals, including members of her extended family who might have posed a threat to her reign, she ensured the continuation of her power. However, these decisions, while politically sound, also revealed the brutal truth about dynastic politics. The pursuit of power often required the destruction of those closest to you. The morality of Hatshepsut's actions becomes complicated when viewed through this lens. Did she betray her own family for the sake of her kingdom, or was her betrayal merely a reflection of the political environment in which she lived, where the survival of the state justified the destruction of the individual? Nefertiti, too, faced moral compromises in her time as a queen, particularly in her role in the religious upheaval orchestrated by her husband, Akhenaten. Akhenaten's radical shift to Atenism, a monotheistic religion that displaced Egypt's traditional pantheon of gods, placed Nefertiti in the center of one of the most controversial periods in Egypt's history. As Akhenaten's queen, Nefertiti was not only complicit in his religious revolution but may have actively supported it. The switch from polytheism to monotheism wasn't just a religious reformation, it was a political statement, a rejection of the old order that alienated powerful factions within the court. But for Nefertiti this shift came at a cost. The religious revolution fractured Egyptian society, caused widespread discontent among the priesthood, and left Egypt vulnerable to foreign threats. Yet, Nefertiti, like Hatshepsut, navigated these dangers with cunning. She may have used her position to secure power for herself and her daughters, but the moral price of supporting a regime that turned Egypt's religious foundations upside down is undeniable. She lived through a period of extreme social and political upheaval, and the choices she made cannot be viewed as those of a simple consort. Nefertiti's complicity in Akhenaten's policies speaks to a greater moral dilemma. Is it justified to use one's power to maintain stability, even if that means supporting policies that could lead to social division and unrest? The theme of sacrifice looms large in the lives of these queens. They were not just rulers, they were symbols of their societies, and their personal sacrifices were integral to the larger sacrifice they made for their nations. Cleopatra sacrificed her personal happiness for Egypt's survival. Hatshepsut sacrificed her identity and family relationships for political gain. Nefertiti sacrificed the cultural stability of Egypt for religious reform. Each queen in her own way bore the burden of power, understanding that, in the end, their actions would shape the legacy of their rule. This moral tension between personal sacrifice and political necessity was the defining struggle for these women. They lived in a world where power was fleeting, fragile, and always under threat. The choices they made, however morally questionable, were rooted in an understanding that to rule was to engage in a constant battle for survival. The greatest price they paid was not just the personal cost of their actions but the moral compromises they were forced to make in order to maintain their authority. The legacy of these queens forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about power. How far would you go to secure your survival? What are you willing to sacrifice in order to protect your kingdom, your family, and your people? The morality of power, as demonstrated by these queens, is never black and white. It is defined by the complexities of leadership, the brutal realities of governance, and the difficult choices that must be made to preserve the state. In the end, their stories show us that power, while often a means of securing one's legacy, always comes at a moral cost, one that can never be fully understood until it's too late. The reigns of Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti offer us a glimpse into the world of power, ambition, and survival, but they also serve as a reminder of the cost of such power. Their stories are not just those of queens, though they were certainly that. They are the stories of women who, against all odds, rose to wield authority in a world where such power was almost exclusively reserved for men. Yet, the lengths to which they went to maintain and secure their thrones were as tragic as they were extraordinary. These queens shaped Egypt's history in profound ways, but in doing so they paid a high price, and their legacies have been both revered and obscured by time. When we look back at their stories, we are faced with a haunting question. What remains of their legacy? Is it the image of divine beauty and cunning political strategy that survives, or are we left with a deeper, darker reflection of their lives, filled with sacrifice, betrayal, and moral compromise? The lives of these queens raise uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, the forces that shape it, and the price one must pay to hold it. Despite their exceptional achievements, these women's stories are often shrouded in mystery, and their legacies were deliberately obscured by those who followed them, both to erase their rule and to rewrite history to fit the narrative of male dominance. For Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, history has a particularly tragic and romanticized view. She is often remembered as the seductive queen who captured the hearts of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but this view simplifies the complexity of her rule. Cleopatra was not just a lover or a pawn in the grand political game of Rome. She was a masterful strategist, capable of navigating the most treacherous political waters. She fought relentlessly to preserve Egypt's independence, using her intellect and alliances to secure her throne and her people's future. Yet her death marked the end of an era for Egypt, and with her passing the kingdom fell under the control of the Roman Empire. Her legacy in many ways is a tragic one. Cleopatra's attempt to balance the personal with the political, her manipulation of love and power, ultimately led to her downfall. In the end, Egypt's independence was lost, and Cleopatra's story became one of despair, as she faced the inevitable forces of Roman imperialism. Similarly, Hatshepsut's story is one of triumph shadowed by erasure. As the longest reigning female pharaoh in Egypt's history, she is credited with expanding Egypt's wealth, leading successful military campaigns, and building some of the most stunning monuments of the new kingdom. However, her legacy was systematically destroyed by her successor, Thutmose III. After her death, Thutmose III went to great lengths to erase her name from history, defacing her monuments and removing her image from the royal record. This attempt to erase Hatshepsut from history was driven by more than political rivalry. It was an effort to reclaim Egypt's throne for a male ruler, highlighting the societal and cultural prejudices that hindered women's rule. Her erasure was not just the action of a rival pharaoh but the reflection of a larger belief that a woman's reign was unnatural and needed to be expunged from history. Despite these efforts, Hatshepsut's legacy has survived. Modern historians and archaeologists have uncovered evidence of her reign, showing that her contributions to Egypt were far-reaching and transformative. Yet, the shadow of her erasure remains, a reminder of the dangers women in power faced and the difficulty of maintaining a legacy when society was unprepared to accept female rulers. Nefertiti's legacy, too, is clouded in mystery and ambiguity. Though she was the queen alongside Akhenaten during one of Egypt's most controversial religious revolutions, her role in this upheaval remains unclear. Akhenaten's shift from polytheism to monotheism, centering the worship of Aten, drastically changed Egypt's religious and political landscape. Nefertiti, as his queen, may have been an active participant in this revolution, but her role was overshadowed by her husband's radical ideas. Following Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti's fate remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest that she ruled as pharaoh for a brief period, possibly under the name of Smenkhare, but this theory remains speculative. What is certain, however, is that after her apparent disappearance from the record, Egypt returned to its traditional polytheistic practices under Tutankhamun, and her name was largely erased from the historical record. In the modern era, Nefertiti has become a symbol of beauty and power, with her famous bust serving as a lasting icon of ancient Egyptian art. Yet, the shadow of her erasure and the question of her true legacy linger. Was Nefertiti a mere consort to Akhenaten, or did she wield substantial power in her own right? The truth may never be fully known, but Nefertiti's legacy remains one of both mystery and fascination, representing the complex and often obscured role of women in ancient political structures. The legacies of Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti are defined by both their extraordinary achievements and their tragic erasures. They were queens who defied the gendered expectations of their time, asserting their power in ways that were unprecedented. They fought to preserve their kingdoms, protect their families, and secure their people's futures. But they also made profound sacrifices, compromising their personal morals and even their identities to maintain their power. Their stories reflect the high price of authority, the difficult choices that come with leadership, and the harsh realities faced by women who sought to rule in a world where men dominated. In the end, their legacies are not easily defined. They are not just stories of power or beauty, but of survival in a world that did not welcome their rule. Their lives are filled with contradictions, love and betrayal, beauty and brutality, faith and cruelty, reminding us that power, particularly for women in ancient societies, was a double-edged sword. Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti were queens who lived and ruled at the highest stakes, and their legacy continues to haunt us because in many ways, their struggles for power reflect universal truths about the human condition. The pursuit of greatness often demands great sacrifice, and those who dare to wield power must face the cost of their actions. Their stories serve as both a warning and a lesson, a haunting reminder of the complexities of leadership and the price of ambition. In the end, the haunting legacy of these queens reminds us that power, whether earned or inherited, always comes with a cost that echoes down through the ages, shaping history and leaving an indelible mark on those who dare to rule.